Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots and Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Shutt, here. Happy to have my friend James Mitchell here with us today. James, how are you doing, sir?
Hey Nick, what's going on?
Oh man, I'm just living the dream, sir. It's another day in paradise. Yeah, man, really appreciate you taking the time to chat today on Robots and Red Tape, man. Love if you'd tell the audience just kind of a little bit about yourself, your
Sure,
background, and kind of how you got here, man.
sure. Yeah. How did I get here? That's a really good question. I I've spent about 20 years in and around government of all kinds, both state and local, mostly federal, as well as on the commercial side as a consultant, and really made my bones on large, complicated, high risk, high visibility, high dollar programs, starting with Department of Homeland Security on all the preparedness grant programs right after 9/11 and into Katrina, and then moving into FEMA procurement right around the time of Hurricane Sandy.
Mhm.
Really active in the emergency management and public safety perspective. And after that, after sort of cutting my teeth on grants and procurement, moving money out into hands of state and local and the market at large, I went over to the Department of Commerce where I helped stand up the FirstNet program, which is a multi-billion-dollar dedicated public safety network on broadband, which is now run by AT&T and the Department of Commerce, and got a bug for seeing what happens when government gets creative with procurement, not just the linear dollars out the door, but what can you do once it's out there? How can you build a reinvestment strategy? How can you drive an ecosystem to your program? So after FirstNet, I went out into actually in the NG911 space, working for a small company called Rapid Deploy, where we basically took similar concepts of bringing new technology to what I would call legacy public safety functions. Public safety to me, it's a passion. They're one of the most underserved levels of government in the country. They do so much with so little. So I've spent most of my career trying to give as much to that organization or those organizations as possible. And how I got here, now I'm at a company called Itero Group. We consult with a lot of the companies that are in that ecosystem or around that ecosystem, not so much around public safety, but you think about business critical, mission critical, emerging technologies, really big transformation projects that kind of speak to my background, and it's really what I enjoy is seeing the lights go off for people on new stuff and how they can implement it. That's where we sit, and so on a daily basis, that's the kind of stuff I'm engaging in, and I'm excited to talk more about it today.
Absolutely, man. I'm really excited to talk about it as well. I think it's underfunded and underappreciated until you call 911 and
Yeah,
expect people to show up, right? And I think that I think that you're absolutely right. So it is underfunded, and for the how critical it is to our society at large, right? Because when you start thinking about like there are things that we expect as a society. One of them is that when you call 911, whether you need police, an ambulance, fire truck, whatever, that somebody's going to pick up and somebody's going to come out and be deployed. And you're absolutely right. It is very, very underappreciated and underfunded. So really appreciate all the work you've done there, and love if you kind of tell us, high level for everybody that doesn't know, like kind of what FirstNet is
sure.
really, kind of define that, and then talk about, kind of where I think is that from what I remember, it came out 10-ish years ago, maybe a little bit more, was when it kind of started, where it
Yeah.
is, what kind of the iterations and what the state of it is now.
Yeah, so it's a really, for me, it's an interesting story. I I think it's important to remember that in after 9/11, and frankly after every major, I'll call macro emergency or disaster in history, there's always been a response from government to say how can we do things better, which is the right thing to do, right?
Mhm.
Uh, Whether or not they follow through on a lot of those of their own considerations, so Congress on down to local government, it's really hard to hold people accountable from a policy perspective to go do those things, especially when you talk about industry, right? Like how is industry and what industry or the market is doing to in response along with government, right, which has a public policy mandate to go do the right thing. What does industry want to do, right? Industry wants to make money, which is natural. We're in a capitalist society. That's how it works. Aligning the incentives between government and industry is very difficult even when there's a major disaster. 9/11 presented, quite honestly, a new opportunity for industry and government to work together on a number of fronts, the least of which not being communications, right, and technology and communication. We all experience it as commercial users of broadband. Your cell phones went down, or your
Mhm.
landlines went down. I mean, cellular technology is pretty new if you think about it in terms of humanity at
Right.
large. So I think after for FirstNet, and just to describe what that is by way of this origin story, which I'm probably rambling too much here, but when Congress wrote the 9/11 report, the commission, the 9/11 commission set up by Congress, wrote this report with a bunch of recommendations. Threaded throughout was this communications failure,
Mm.
right, which we saw frequently after disaster after disaster. Every after action plan said we got to get better on communications. There was no existing broadband capability for first responders at the time. So this is 2001 to 2003, if you remember that time frame. Um, Cellular communications were still pretty nascent. So, in about 10 years after that report was written, and all this work had been done by land mobile radio companies like Motorola and Harris to try and create interoperability standards so public safety could talk to each other and communications could stay up. I mean, huge investments made by Department of Homeland Security. Um, there was an act that came out in 2012, Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Act. I think it's what, if I remember the title correctly. And there's this paragraph in there that says that there'll be a nationwide public safety broadband network stood up by the Department of Commerce, and it's about 15 lines, sort of authorizing Commerce to go and spend a bunch of money and take dedicated radio spectrum, which is the airwaves that we use to communicate over our cell phones, dedicated to public safety access to a network that you and I today enjoy as commercial users, with a bunch of bells and whistles thrown in, right? So giving them access to things like priority and preemption, which means they cut to the front of the line when there's a huge amount of traffic on a network because a disasters happen or for whatever reason. Giving them access to things like what they call high-powered user equipment, which lets you go further from a network point of access, like a tower or a 5G access point. You can actually there's chipsets that can go much further than what we have today on our cell phones.
Mm.
And really, I think the key feature here is that FirstNet, the nationwide public safety broadband network, would be available in 56 states and territories in DC. There is no other network like it. There was no network like it at the time. Public safety was served largely by commercial carriers like you and I. And sometimes I remember you'd talk to fire chiefs or police chiefs, and they'd have 4 or 5 devices around their waistband, all for different networks, because they didn't know what was going to work where, when,
Mhm.
and that's not a good feeling if you're running into a burning building or getting shot at. So our mandate at FirstNet for anyone who worked there was to understand that we were trying to solve what we thought was honestly an unsolvable problem at the time. Like we were handed $7 billion in cash, which was a loan from the Department of Treasury to go do this, and band 14, which was 700 megahertz or 20 megahertz to 700 megahertz spectrum, which is, if you know anything about spectrum, it's prime real estate. We call it beachfront property. It was great accessibility. You could a huge pipe for data, right? And we all knew data was going to be the next thing. So when FirstNet was stood up, uh, we had achieved a couple things that government really hadn't done before. We created a self-sustaining, non-appropriated program in the multi-billion-dollar range, right? That $7 billion loan was paid back through a spectrum called AWS, I think AWS 3 by the FCC. So all this stuff kind of fell into place to make it this self-sustaining, zero tax burden uh, program that when we felt like the dog that caught the mail truck, right? Like all of a sudden the staff of like 30 people were like, oh, we probably have to like really grow here and wrap our heads around this massive thing. You'd partner with a company like AT&T, which is a huge company with a
Mhm.
huge customer base, who've now said it's their edicts to go and get public safety and grow this, and build this network and grow this network. Was pretty incredible, and it's thriving today. So I think it's a really good example. It's probably one of the few examples where government's really gotten it right, and industry has come along, met the mission, and same incentives, right? Like AT&T gets to make money, the government gets to solve this huge problem for public safety, and the
Mhm.
market responds in kind. So it's pretty fun to
Mhm.
watch.
Oh man, that's fantastic. And what was your role in the like the beginning and building it up, and how did you have the opportunity to get involved and be involved?
That's a good question because if you've ever been part of it, if you've ever had the pleasure of being at an agency in its infancy, like I was at DHS when it was standing up, you get a title, but it means absolutely nothing, right? Like
Mhm,
you are in a startup mode. So I was hired as just a, a program manager. The first job was to build a PMO and to hire people to go and facilitate some basic back office functions for the FirstNet authority at the time. And like I said, there's only about 30 of us there, and we were in this like makeshift set of offices in the U.S. Geological Survey building in Reston, Virginia.
mhm.
With I remember like my first procurement was office chairs that just because we just had nowhere to sit.
Right.
So that was my first job. But then I was asked a few months into it if I'd take on the acquisition lead role and build the procurement team and run the source selection evaluation board eventually. And uh, I'd been around procurement. I'd served on evaluation boards before, like everybody else. I'd run some procurements, but nothing of this size and scale. But there were only a few of us that had done procurement before, so started partnering immediately with organizations like DISA and Department of Interior that have shared services and capabilities that to go make that happen, and we did. So I ran the evaluation, then I stepped out of that role in 2017 and helped stand up the actual sort of the storm and norm process of partnering with AT&T, and it is a partnership. Contracts aside, there's a dedicated team there as well, making sure that we were aligned. And that, so I ran a senior director of network operations, I think is what we called it, and then I ended up being chief of staff to the executive director or the CEO as they're called at the authority, which is an odd title for a government entity, but that's exactly what it is, right? So yeah, I've had a couple different hats there.
Oh, that's fantastic, James. That's awesome. And um, how first, how cool to actually see something that you literally started
Oh
in
yeah.
infancy to go up and to frankly to impact people's lives, right? I think that, something that you touched on is that, in our capital society industry, like where you are now, where I am, our goal is to return profits, right? To
Yeah.
either private organizations, but government's job and how I've always seen it is it's to provide services to provide services to its taxpayer base, right? Whether that's
Mhm.
different healthcare programs, national parks, or infrastructure like this and critical infrastructure like this. That's phenomenal to have. I'm sure it feels great to have helped impact these folks that their day-to-day lives, and these are the ones that are running into the twin towers on 9/11, right? Or as an example. And so can you give some examples about how like the FirstNet rollout, now that it's up and live and operating, how is it like affecting first responders' abilities
Sure.
to communicate? And yeah, how does that also translate to like improved response times?
Yeah. So a couple things. First off, when we were developing the RFP, we actually at the same time were running a bunch of studies on what we called socioeconomic impact. So we were the weird thing is you're given this objective to go solve this problem that everyone recognized on 9/11, which I mean it couldn't talk about the worst day of any first responder's life, right? And then multiply it by thousands, and that makes that communications issue. It actually exacerbates the ability to go solve it because you're trying to solve this massive scale thing. And it's like, well, no, what we're actually solving is a daily issue for
Mhm,
public safety, which is first, like redundant communications. They have their land level radio, and if that doesn't work, they have their commercial device, which probably isn't working either, especially if they're in rural America.
mhm,
So, or they have a trunk system in their vehicle, which they've probably left the vehicle by now. So, you think about the use case, you have to boil it down from Congress's use case, which is 9/11. You got to boil it down to like, writing a ticket uh, for a potentially stolen vehicle in on Route 66 in the middle of Nevada with no connectivity. How do that's extreme as well, but that's a different extreme. The pressure is a little bit lower, obviously, but what are my metrics for success in that environment, especially when you're thinking about writing an RFP? when LTE is pretty much new, right? So 4G LTE was new at the time. And by the time we made the award a few years later, 5G was just starting to
Mhm,
be talked about a little bit. So we had to plan ahead for services that we didn't think potentially would be available. Like we had to kind of leave a pretty wide berth for offers to come in and propose their unique capabilities
mhm,
and do it in a way that we weren't just enticing telecommunications as a market, but also think about data as a market. And so when you think about that cop or that sheriff who's pulled that person over in the middle of nowhere, what technology was available to us then to shorten potential response time, either ambulatory or if there's a pursuit for backup, like by seconds, what is that? Is that accretive? Is that the only metric that we can look at, or is it just like access to the network? Is it like you mentioned, high powered user equipment or satellite backhaul? Like what other elements can we bring to that scenario that close the gap between the officer beside the vehicle and headquarters
mhm,
or other participating agencies? And the truth was, at the time, we really didn't know. And so we actually brought in a firm to go do some studies before we even put pen to paper on the RFP to see what we could actually measure when it happened.
mhm,
Now, as it happens, like when you go to contract, you build the quality assurance surveillance plan. There's a bunch of stuff you got to put in there from a technical success perspective, right? The network works, got it, right? How do we measure that? That's pretty easy. But when we think about it in the hand of customers or users, it really is up to that user to report issues. Not that you can't trust the vendor, but like
mm,
the users got that feedback loop has to be there. So
yeah,
we put in elements that incentivize and in many cases required that feedback loop to be there, not just for the vendor AT&T, but for also the authority, the government entity, because that access to public safety and hearing the voice, the most vocal community everywhere. By the way, like public safety will tell you when things
mhm,
don't work, which is great.
mhm,
They're not as good at telling you when things are super awesome because that doesn't matter. If it works, it works. It's supposed to work. Like, why would I give you a high five for something that works, right?
mhm,
So sussing that out and being able to capture it in a meaningful way was a challenge. But I will tell you that for many of the users that report back, especially at the agency enterprise level, and what I mean is like NYPD, FDNY, like the big names that you want, the recognizable public safety brand, they'll come back and it's fluid. They will tell you when things work, don't work, and many times they take ownership and accountability, and they will look at their own operations plans and what they did and say, did I put this in the right place in my workflow? Because it
mhm,
didn't replace anything. Like let's be clear, FirstNet didn't replace anything other than their potentially the commercial use of the network. It augments their existing operations, and that's what it was designed to do. No one was coming to replace radio or any sort of vehicular systems. It was like,
mhm.
what can we put on top of this or around this or integrate with it to bring those response times down. And yeah, there's a number of examples out there. You can look it up. I mean, I think it's important to note that um, I think the biggest challenge that was solved for public safety was again that accessibility to other units, that closing the gap to headquarters. You think about ambulances now that have broadband built in to send, uh, you know, um, uh, critical health data in advance of arriving in an emergency room to the emergency room, so the right beds are set up and the right equipment set up. That all exists now, right? So there's like a waterfall of things that happened in the marketplace that were probably eventually going to happen at some point on some kind of technology. This
Mhm.
really did accelerate it, though. I mean, it's probably by about 5 or maybe even 8 years, you saw stuff pop up that probably wouldn't have compelled industry to make a move without this massive investment from the government and AT&T, quite honestly.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and it's a lot of those little things, and we say little things, it's things that you don't think about. It's like, is the
Yeah.
ambulance, are those medical records and medical statuses being sent ahead, right? Um, to and how many lives does that save, right?
Well,
On a
so
daily
this
basis.
is yeah. So something I try to, and again, this isn't a statement from modesty or anything. It's like the people saving lives here are public safety. The technology that they use is a choice that they make in that role where they're saving lives. FirstNet does not. FirstNet does not directly, cannot directly say, that this
Mhm,
idea of there's a fear of stolen valor, right?
mhm,
That, and I've heard some companies, say that they support public safety and saving lives. That's fine. The technology itself, though, in many cases, unless the public safety person said that if they didn't have it, there would be another outcome. And there are those cases, right?
mhm,
But we are very quick. Those of us who are at least in the early days, and many of us that are still there at the authority are very quick to just kind of whoa, like that's not what we're doing.
mhm.
What we're doing is we're supporting operations, and that's the best thing that we can do. And we're excited to do it, right? Because I think
Yeah,
it is cool to see this stuff happen in motion.
absolutely. But it sounds like you really set up and built the infrastructure that all of these other more, I don't want to say fancy, but all these other technologies utilize to enhance public safety, right? And
Right.
to the point you just made, FirstNet accelerated it by, 5 to 8 years and so understanding that like how, and when you start like when I and also with the 9/11 example of communication not working, how many times would that have happened over the last 10 years, right? Where you
Yeah.
can't I can think of a couple of examples of times that, yeah, especially here in the DC area where things might have happened where you couldn't, wouldn't be able to reach out, things like that, and public safety might go down. How does and I just think it's really cool to see what you have helped build and see how it trickles down to the day-to-day lives of the end users, right? Which are the public safety officials, which are, doctors, firefighters, policemen, policewomen, and understanding how it has all worked together to enable them to do their job better and more efficiently, which is just, I mean, that's really, really cool.
Yeah,
Um,
it feels good. And I just to pull on that a little bit, I think what's important for me was in the architecture of the actual contract or the RFP. The we weren't going to force anybody to do anything. This is the key, right? There was no, even for federal users, there was no mechanism or by the authority or OMB or anyone to say you must use FirstNet when it becomes available.
mhm,
And the reason for that is because if you force someone to use a service, what incentivizes the service provider to make it better, right?
mhm,
Competition is key. Introducing a competitive element into the marketplace where there wasn't one really there before to drive vendors to behave differently for a user set that needed to have something that were operated differently. That was the biggest success, and by being very clear with the public safety market that they did not have to adopt this. And if they adopted it, it was their choice. And by choosing to adopt it, they were influencing their outcomes because they were going to participate in it's a 25-year contract, right?
mhm,
There's a reinvestment process here that's in place where the government invests in the evolution of that network, but only in things that they're compelled to do so by public safety. So they're
mhm,
not going to go invest in the network and say, I want a new iPhone for public safety that has a red flag on it. Like
mhm,
that's insane.
right,
No, are we going to invest in potential hardware augmentation that gives you, because firefighters have gloves and they have masks, like we FaceTime or face recognition and thumbprints don't work. So how do I get you identity credentialing and access
mhm,
management that makes sense for the user? That's something you invest in, right?
mhm,
And that's not something that anyone else is going to invest in for you.
right,
So I think that's really key because without that mandate, it opens up this series of opportunities to be selective about your investment and to listen to your public safety user base
mhm.
um, to drive those investments.
That's fantastic. No, and that is something that I personally didn't think about, but you think about how the market reacted to that. Like, how long did it take? And I mean, I'm an iPhone user. How long did it take Apple to come up with a way to use facial recognition while you were wearing a mask during COVID? It was a couple of years, right? Like,
Yeah, that's
and that, I mean, that could be because they weren't really motivated to, but at the same time, that is a far lower I mean, that's not a there's a lot less risk associated with that than a firefighter who's in a fire having access to their comms gear, right?
Right.
And so, but again, I think, the market responds, but it doesn't always respond as quickly unless there's and I think that's a great role for government is to
Yeah.
incentivize rolling out features that, people need that aren't necessarily profit based for companies, right?
Hmm.
Um,
That's right.
yeah. So, and then what were some of the, obviously, like I know, like working with some of these bigger, like brand recognized agencies was really, I'm sure that was cool. But I would also guess that a lot of the really, really rewarding work was going to, rural communities and underserved communities where they
Oh
didn't
yeah.
have this kind of bandwidth and technology to begin with. What were some of the challenges associated with rolling these systems out in areas without that kind of infrastructure to begin with? And how was that different than like doing it in New York City or in DC?
So that's a good question. It's a really good question because first off, rural was a huge concern. It's always a
Mhm,
concern in any network build, but for the government in particular, we did not want to overbuild into rural areas. And what I mean is have a large telecommunications firm or even like a Google or whoever would show up. And again, this is all speculative when we're building the thing or the RFP. We did not want to overrun the vast rural telecommunications market that the U.S. has. So we put in, it was one of the few requirements in the contract that said you must partner with rural carriers, right? And oh, by the way, at the same time, meet all the supply chain security requirements that we've placed on you uh, before you can even think about writing your proposal. So those teaming requirements helped drive an interaction between your prime vendor and rural partners that they go select uh, that the government has recognized, and we actually went through a process um, with our partners at NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration, at Commerce, to validate those carriers as being viable for from all the security, whatever, what do you want to call it? Like there was a number of requirements we put in place to make sure that that happened the right way. Because that's the first piece. The second piece was the rural public safety mission is very different than your highly densely populated areas, like your urban centers, or the NFL cities as we call them, right? The 35 or so NFL cities that are out there. So when you go to a rural community, and it could be in rural Alabama, it could be in Guam, right?
mhm,
Those challenges are going to feel similar, but they're definitely different. First of all, being the government going into a rural area in America, and you say you're here to help, they're not going to believe you,
mhm,
and public safety sure isn't going to believe you. So there was a huge consultation process that we undertook before we even released an RFI to go meet with as many public safety agencies as we possibly could all around the country. We hired an entire staff to go do that full-time job on the road. These guys have platinum level miles now. They've been all over the country 3 or 4 times to go make this thing happen. And they did yeoman's work to make that happen. And by the time I showed up in any of these communities, the beach was softened. It was an easy
mhm,
conversation with a lot of these folks because they knew we were there to get their input and take it back to the procurement process, which was really important. And they saw themselves in the RFP when it came out. So that was an exhaustive process, and it was certainly worth it. So by the time the network was being deployed, you had some communities that didn't even have radio systems, right? They were through a ticket system. They're writing it like you would write at a diner, right? In the 50s, here's taking your order. Um, so you could leapfrog a bunch of technology, put broadband in their hands. And oh, by the way, it's one hundredth the cost to pick up a cell phone bill than it is to deploy your own radio network
mhm,
and run land mobile radios for 4 or 5 officers. So now all of a sudden they had this cellular network where they didn't have coverage before. And you know, specifically with this build, it was interesting because yeah, AT&T is a commercial company. They've got commercial assets. They've got commercial deployments ongoing all the time.
mhm,
Part of the RFP talked about economies of scale where there was no way you could just deploy our spectrum in the wild by itself across the country without a partner to go do it. That could have been anybody, but it certainly helped that we could piggyback on other commercial deployments. And what I mean is, it's essentially, I'm not just going to go hang one strand of Christmas lights, right, and then wait till next year to hang another one. I'm going to do it all at once. I'm going to do it up the right way, and that's what you do with networks, right? You hang 4 or 5 different bands of spectrum at once to capitalize on your economies of scale. We did that in rural areas, and that was not a. I wouldn't say it's not uncommon. I think the approach was novel because we focused on markets that were not prioritized in, say, a 4G rollout or a 3G rollout, because you want population, because that means revenue and subscriptions.
Mhm.
Um, we had adoption targets in the RFP that are required to hit by county, right? So you've got to hit those targets at a very local level, and that includes rural America.
Mhm.
So you can't go deploy in New York without deploying in, Thomasville, Georgia. You got
Right.
to do it all, and you have to do it in a way that makes sense economically.
Mhm.
And from a features perspective, I'm democratizing access to broadband for public safety. Everyone has the same service everywhere, all the time. No questions asked. You can't turn one off in one place because they don't need it. They have it no matter what. So going back to that macro disaster view of 9/11 and answering that requirement all the way down to that remote. I'm in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. The same customer experience must occur. No drop calls, priority and preemption, eventually push to talk, video, all of that stuff has to exist in all those places. That's something that never really had been done before from a deployment perspective. So when you explain to folks in rural territories, they're getting the New York City treatment,
Mhm.
right? They love it,
Yeah.
right? And they feel like that, and that's not been the experience for
No.
most folks in those. And I was born in Mississippi, so and I've been all over the world, but I mean, if you go to rural parts of this country, it is a. I'm sure you've been there. It
Mhm.
is a stark contrast from a service capability, and we solved that problem for public safety in a very meaningful way.
That's fantastic. No, and I see it from like, I have people that I work with and work for me that are in either like Southern Virginia or out, and you see like for like the internet quality, like and availability of high speed internet. You just like as like that just vastly different, right?
Yeah,
And then absolutely when you start talking about scaling it up to larger like to public safety and their needs and how much more important it is that they have connectivity versus, somebody being able to stream Netflix. I think it's, vastly, vastly different. And but everybody should still have the same access, right? I've
yeah,
personally thought for a long time that internet access should be treated like any other utility in this country because it is, and, like, I'm not an expert, and so I'm sure you'll have opinions on that, James, but, like, I think that it is as vital to the modern world as, say, electricity or running water, and we should treat it as such.
yeah. It's the old argument around entitlement, and I think broadband is no longer, well, it shouldn't be viewed as a commodity. I think it is something that's just kind of like oxygen. Like,
Mhm,
I, and part of that is that's an old argument that it is a utility. I think it's post utilities, right? This is fundamentally platform access, because the number of services that you and I, as just participants in the U.S. capital market, we are required to have access to the DMV, like some government, obviously government entitlements, but also I pay my bills over the internet, and many companies incentivize that through paperless and things like that. If I don't have internet, I know my life would be upside down, and there are people in this country who do not have internet, who but are ironically also entitled to certain government services that they don't have access to. And you think about I mean, not to get off topic, but like the VA,
mhm,
and their reach to veterans who need mental health assistance, or you know The VA's done and made excellent strides in the last few years in closing the gap between veterans in need and the services they provide. But a lot of that really relies on broadband access,
Mhm.
and many of those veterans live in rural areas
Oh, yeah.
with limited broadband access. It's a reality. So at some point, and FirstNet wasn't designed to answer this particular issue. It was certainly an ancillary benefit of having a large carrier like AT&T go and deploy in places that maybe it wasn't really heavily deployed in before. Seeing those coverage maps kind of glow and grow, and hearing the stories of people connecting for reasons other than public safety, who were members of public safety, who now had access to broadband and were using it in ways that they were more than, they can use it for anything. They use it for operational, whatever. They can use it like we do for phone calls to the family back home or FaceTime videos.
Mhm.
That's a metric I'd love to apply, right? Like, did your quality of life improve in addition to your quality of work life? I'd venture guess it's yes, but that's only because I know what it would be like without it, right? And just keeping that in mind, I think is important.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so, how does where's the intersection point between
Yeah.
m FirstNet and just 911 infrastructure at large? And, where do they intersect, and, how do they interact with each other?
Yeah. So on 911, and having spent a couple years trying to frankly solve this problem on the industry side, it's it's unfortunate. Uh, so first, as a user, as a just a John taxpayer, I'm going to call 911 and I expect a certain outcome. I'm not calling 911 because it's a good day, right? This is
Mhm.
probably the worst day of my life. And oh, by
Well,
the way, I'm probably the fifth or sixth, maybe 10th, 12th call that the call taker has taken, and they're hearing my horrible situation, and they've got to, there's a human element here that I think is
mhm.
really important to highlight, that technology simply isn't going to solve. But it can certainly augment sort of the more positive side of things, which is, you talk about the intersect between FirstNet and 911. I think it's important to realize that 911 systems in this country, or the last technical refresh for 911 was like nationwide was like 1970 something. A lot of these networks are still run on old copper. So there's not a lot of fiber optics out there unless industry's gone and installed and done a complete facelift.
Mhm.
So it's really been an industry approach more so than government. Every next gen was called Next Generation 911. So the idea that you move to fiber optic networks with a single nationwide next generation core to help drive a digital 911 world,
Mhm.
so you can have more data flowing to the call center and back to the user, text, video, all that stuff. Legislation fails over and over and over again, and there's an entire NG911 commission set up with like 90 members of Congress. So I think they meet once a year. I don't know, but no one's doing enough about it. Uh, Period. That's a personal opinion that I'd love to see change.
Yeah.
Um, that there is an intersect for FirstNet, but FirstNet was very clearly in every piece of legislation, by the way, that's come out. There's a line about FirstNet, how FirstNet can't be used to solve 911, which I think is horribly cynical. Because if there was one program that could probably solve NG 911, it is the FirstNet program. It's that partnership with NTIA, between the FirstNet Authority, NTIA, and whoever the provider ends up being, or providers. You want an ecosystem, you want a village. You don't want one person doing the whole thing. So, instilling a sense of competition at a local level to get 911 centers. We used to call we use this term a lot, but we democratize public safety communications,
Mhm.
and you got to do it for 911. Every incident, uh, not every, most incident, a majority of incidents
Right.
start with a 911 call, and every incident has a dispatch aspect to it. Every time a cop pulls someone over, every time a fire apparatus is dispatched, there's a call back to the operations center, or the PSAP, the public safety answering point, or whatever you want to call it, to coordinate logistics. And it's a voice call many times.
Mhm.
And you think about how we order pizza or how we get an Uber, and that's a button on my phone and it's instant. Like, that's the kind of stuff that you like to see, platformed, and that's where we'd like an intersect to be. I don't think it's there yet. I haven't seen it in the wild, but I think we're quickly approaching a scenario where the technology that's available to us is actually going to leapfrog the use case. And what I mean is, we shouldn't have to necessarily call 911. If you look at the technology available to us, yes, it should be an option, but like my watch will call 911 for me if I fall.
Mhm,
There's crash detection. All these things are happening in industry, and
mhm,
government's not pushing that at all.
right,
Government's not telling, Apple to do that. Like that's just, or Google. They're doing it for some reason,
mhm.
right? There's obviously a compelling incentive to do so. I don't know where it is. I don't think they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts necessarily, but there's something there, and the government should capitalize on it since there's already forward momentum to do it. It's unfortunate they haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I'm very surprised that the last refresh was, like, 50 years ago. That I did not know that, I know that I think that I know that there are organizations out there that work to address and, like, the mental health piece of being a first responder because there is absolutely a large toll associated with that, right?
Yeah,
And I know some nonprofits that run or nonprofits and therapy companies that specialize in this, and they run groups for first responders and
yeah,
first responders and 911, people that work at the 911 call centers and who like are the bridge between the first responders and the public, right? Because they're the bridge. But I know some people, and I know when you start talking about like remembering things, when you're emotionally charged, that's when you're going to remember everything, right? In a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you were calm. And so you start like the people, when to your point, when you call 911, that is likely one of the worst days of your life. You're going to be very emotional and it's going to be difficult. And you're going to remember if it is not working or if they transfer you to somebody, like you're going to remember all this, right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
And, I think that we should absolutely, I'm curious to how I think we absolutely need to invest more in that infrastructure, whether it's, more traditional 911 call centers or the, underlying technology associated with it, or, even if we had the ability to like FaceTime 911 or whatever. Because I mean, you and I do video meetings all day, every day. Why
Yeah.
couldn't you just FaceTime them and show them what's going on in a way and like have that all be recorded automatically? Like, I just don't is
So
it yeah, I don't know. Like, I feel like there's
no,
still there.
that that stuff exists, right? So
Right.
there's a number of companies. They're small, and they're and most companies that, in my experience, again,
Mhm,
and that I've dealt with in the space, the founders have, or the lead engineers, product managers, they all have a 911 origin story, as we call it. They called 911 and something didn't work, or they were in an incident where they thought this could have gone better and they come up with something. And for some of us outside on the commercial side, we see a lot of new technology on a daily basis. 911 centers do not. They've had the
mhm,
same six screens and four computers and four keyboards for all the systems that don't talk to each other,
mhm,
sitting in front of them for the better part of their career in the center. And you know it's unfortunate, but there are companies that are standing things up that are creative solutions. I could list a bunch here, but I think if you Google some of the features you talked about, if you go and search for video 911, that exists. But what you probably won't find is that many 911 call centers would say we don't want video, right? We get enough bad news over the phone. The last thing I want to do is see someone being traumatized or in a
yeah,
situation. Now, for forensic purposes, there's actually there are companies that will take your video and not send it to the 911 center, but it'll connect you to the officer responding so that they know what's happening when they get there.
mm,
They certainly want to see it
yeah, they
from
do.
a situational perspective, so that that passive um, throughput is there, but only if you've signed up for if you are paying for a certain kind of network where the data is there, the data pipe is there. Um, you know, 911 was actually the first. So we had police, fire, and EMS is what we called primary connections for
Mm,
FirstNet. And within 2 weeks of announcing the contract award, the 911 community reached out to the FirstNet Authority and said, we should be primary connections too.
mhm,
And without, like, we just, like, hardly into a conversation. Yes, absolutely. So 911 centers actually have access to FirstNet on their cellular devices, and I think some other devices that have been released since that, more of a desktop approach. It does not solve the NG911 issue, though. It does not solve the sort of what I would call the national um, what a national mandate for NG 911 would be. And it's actually it's about public safety and the call takers and dispatchers, but it's also about the taxpayer and the experience that you have, um, with a 911 center. Because you're right, like it you want everything that's bad should have happened already when you call 911. You don't want it to that bad experience to percolate into the workflow or whatever the operational response is,
Mhm,
um, to that call. So yeah, it's going to be. I don't know if we'll see an investment anytime soon.
mhm,
Uh, I think it's going to take industry to really look at first as an example of what could happen in the public safety community, and try and build off of that. Even if it's not, AT&T or whoever, like it could be a group of companies coming together to create a stack for public
mhm,
safety that didn't exist before. Because really, what we're talking about is platform for delivery.
mhm,
Um, what didn't exist before FirstNet and what doesn't exist for 911 now is a consistent platform.
mhm,
FirstNet provides a consistent platform, a dedicated core, a dedicated network. So, when you're in the FirstNet, when you're on the FirstNet network, you have an application store that's built for FirstNet. You have a specific identification number in your device that says you're on FirstNet, that tells the network how to treat you. You have uh, faster data. Priority and preemption data is, if you've never seen it in action, it's incredible. FirstNet's at every Super Bowl and every major sporting event. They do a bunch of planned events,
mhm,
and they do tests at those events. And without fail, like the experience of a FirstNet customer is better than any commercial user. So
mhm,
right there, you've got it's like that speaks for itself.
mhm,
911, you want the same thing. You want a consistent access. You want consistent access to a platform that everyone's having that same experience. Remember the New York and Nevada example. Like you want folks to feel the same way, whether I'm a 5-person PSAP at
mhm,
3 in the morning on a Saturday in Tallahassee, Florida, or a 200-person PSAP in Chicago, same time in the country. That's not a great time to be in a PSAP. That's a lot
mhm.
of phone calls. It's a lot of traffic. So yeah, that doesn't exist yet, unfortunately.
Okay. Where, with the amount of time that you spent and thought you spent in and around, the infrastructure supporting, the EMS folks, fire, police,
Mhm.
911, everything. Where do you think we should go from a platform perspective as you look
Yeah.
to the future of, interacting between the public and whether police, fire, what have you? Where do you think we should go? And yeah, what do you think we're missing that we don't have now?
Yeah, so there could be the big things that we're missing, and I think we just haven't given it enough time for the community of users to provide the feedback on how, because the people that are going to solve a lot of these problems that are sort of post platform
Hmm.
are the users. Like any other good software or delivery company knows, like once you put your V1, V2 out there and you create a feedback loop, that's where you're going to capture all of the, maybe not innovation, but you're going to capture the use case, which drives innovation and new solutions and so on and so forth. So I think you need to give public safety time. They are more risk averse than most for all the right reasons. So they're not going to say, hey, I need more video to my device.
Hmm.
Some will, but that's more of a reactive thing. Like everyone thinks video is unlocking this whole other world. I actually, you know, video is part of it. Um, where they're going to go next is probably somewhere commercial users have already been. So, um, voice assistants, which I think people kind of, we went wild for Alexa and Google Home and
Hmm.
maybe not so much Siri, but
Yeah.
you can play the hits. There's voice assistants in vehicles now, for example, and I think that when I think about the things like AI coming up, and and I know you talk about this in your podcast a lot, but that Copilot or that not Microsoft Copilot, but just having someone like a navigator or somebody next to you in a digital format, whether it's a real person or if it's AI, if it's something that's picking up the administrative slack that you have to engage in, even when you're in a high pursuit chase or something, right? Because I think, and we saw this actually. It's interesting. Um, New Zealand deployed broadband commercially for their public safety officers, and New Zealand's a small country,
Mhm.
right? They have a small police force, but they spent an inordinate amount of money on ticket writing and using analog systems for ticket writing, and they moved into a completely end-to-end software-based approach using iPhones back, I think, in 2018, 2019, all on commercial network. Ended up saving the country about $4 million a year or something in
Mm.
just administrative costs, which is a lot. Which is a lot if you consider the size of the police force. So I think you're going to find a lot of these platforms are going to quickly, because of the risk averse population, they're going to quickly move to the administrative burden that's associated with everything you have to do after the fire, after the car chase, after
Mhm.
the arrest, records management, forensics, collection, things like that, and automating a lot of that on the back end, like taking, for instance, transcription of a 911 call from the beginning to the end, and simply tagging it to, or meta tagging it to the incident in a records management system, and then using AI to provide a synopsis, right,
Mhm.
that meets a standard or a compliance requirement. All of that is on a single platform with that software integrating across that single platform can happen.
Mhm.
It's just the will to make it happen.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I think a lot of the administrative stuff's gonna get picked up. I don't think you're gonna see a lot of innovation around the operational side. Like a fire truck's a fire truck. The
Mhm.
fire apparatus is gonna have a ladder. It's gonna have a ton of water,
Yep.
some big hoses. It's gonna seat 8 guys and two on the back. That's gonna be that way for probably a long time, and that's fine because that works, right? Like if it works, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But the stuff that goes inside of that, so low jacks are going to get better. So I can
Mhm.
find out where that fire apparatus is, what the time to destination is, real time reporting. Put LiDAR cameras on the side of this thing, right? Like load it up with cameras and just get a scan of the area. Like how come my car when I put it in reverse can see the entire 360-degree view around my parking lot? That's to me there's a public safety application that we should be doing that with every vehicle. We probably are. It's just how are we communicating that? How are we marketing it? And how are we sharing that capability? So I think that's what you'll see a lot of bolt-on stuff.
Mhm.
But I could be wrong. Maybe they leap into the future with something super crazy, but I just don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, no, and I don't know if the based on what you've told me about 911, their apparatus, I'm not sure if they have the data infrastructure set up to support any of the more, like, advanced analytics programs are there, right? At this
Well, yeah, I mean, no, they probably don't. I'm trying to think. They certainly have a lot of data. Whether or not they're capturing it in a meaningful
Mhm.
way because of the burden, uh, it's probably not happening. Larger 911 centers definitely do. There's more cloud out there than you think when it comes to 911, and how they're using it depends, right? Um, One of the biggest challenges for public safety is uptime and maintaining data networks at what it's five nines, 99.999% of the time, and that's including your maintenance window, right?
Mhm.
Which could be significant. So that uptime challenge is real. And when you talk about data intensive um, processes around things like AI, machine
Mhm.
learning, all the stuff we see out of IoT,
Yeah.
right? Because that's a real thing when you get to smart cities and stuff like that. Which, by the way, I hate that term, but I just
Yeah.
used it.
Mhm.
That can really impact your uptime requirements. So there's a give and take. The other thing is staffing is a huge issue, and I actually think this is a place where AI in particular can help on staffing, not to fill a seat or offset someone who's not at work, whatever, but literally to analyze critical staffing requirements and give the 911 center operator, even like police, fire, whoever has a shift based routine, give them the best plan of action on a weekend, for example. Like, what are your peak response times, which they may have an instinct for, right? 11 o'clock on a Saturday, yeah, there's a lot of tickets being written on a
Mhm.
Saturday night. But am I staffed appropriately?
Right.
Am I sending people to the right places? Can AI help with that? I'm sure it can. I'm saying like we should be investing in that sort of strategy as well to take some of that administrative burden off. Someone who's probably worked 60 hours already behind the wheel of a squad car now has to go write a bunch of tickets and fill out forms and plan the staff for the next week. Like it's a lot of work. So let's try and improve quality of life where we can using new technology like that.
1,000%. And I think you're absolutely right that, and I think that's really one of the best use cases for most of the AI systems that we have out now, are reducing the administrative burden. That's how I do it. That's how I use AI in my organizations,
Yeah.
right? Is figure and and like and I'm also hesitant to use it in some, right? Like in my therapy company, I'm hesitant to utilize AI because I don't trust AI systems, and I think that people become over reliant on tools, and
Oh yeah.
that's not like my company specifically. That's people at large, and like,
Hmm.
there's a huge administrative burden on people, on doctors, therapists, but also, to your point, on people in the 911 center, in that are in the police department, in the fire department, who in the ambulatory departments, and who are, they should not, the things that they bring to the table that they're doing that they cannot be replaced doing, they should be look I think we should be looking at technology and tools to maximize their ability to do that job, right?
Yeah, that's for
As
sure.
opposed, and maximize their time and their brain power to do that job, and reduce the administrative burden associated with the day in, day out of it. We're one of the projects I'm involved in, we're rolling out a new, I mean, you brought up like records management, right? We're rolling out a new records management system at the EPA right now, is on a team doing that, right? Very document heavy agency, but also in addition to that, James, it's one that gets sued a lot, right? And so they have a lot of needs when it comes to reporting and reports, and all of them being stored, and reducing the burden for people agency wide to they can go out and do their job. And if they're doing it there, they should be able to do it at, in more sophisticated ways at like local levels, right?
Right.
In places
That's
that
a
are more
perfect
critical.
example. Yeah, you kind of want to get them worrying about the things that they really need to worry about, right?
Yeah.
I really especially when it comes to any level of government, public safety is included in this. There are a bunch of boxes you have to check. There's a bunch of compliance. There's a reason for that, right? Safety really important. It could also be like some weird union rule. Like, don't know if
Mhm.
it's important, but you got to do it. So, like, being able to parse and frankly, we all do it in our daily lives. Prioritize the stuff that you really need to worry about, and and use technology to solve some of this other stuff. I mean, like, I can't tell you how often I think about how much easier my life would have been. My life, my contracting officers' lives, the COTAR, like the program staff, everybody that was working to develop this FirstNet RFP, just to give the examples, it was like 400 or 500 pages.
Mhm.
And but 60% of that is literally lifted FAR language, or
Right.
it's baked already. Could I have my CO worrying about something else? Like
Mhm.
very strategic people who are sort of squeezed into this machine. It's the same with like a PSAP. I want the person answering to be worried about me, the caller, not like whatever the next three administrative items they have to do
Mhm.
for the day are. And look, by and large, they are worried about me, the caller. But in the off chance that they've had a really bad day themselves, which is very much the case,
Mhm.
and or could be very much the case, then like let's help drive some focus to the real world stuff. And you know, I, we throw in AI a lot, but honestly, that's really for me the promise. Like you just said it. Like I use it for administrivia all the time. Um, I don't use it to like I would rather stare at a blank cursor or a cursor flashing at me on a blank piece of paper that I know I have to fill out myself or create something myself than have a machine go and create for me. But it's also a really good way to get your references right, to
Mhm.
get a starting point at you can do conversational stuff to get you out of whatever the rut is so you can focus on the really important stuff. That's what we should be looking at from an application perspective.
1,000%. No, 1,000%. I completely agree with you, and I think that a lot of I think there are absolutely some good use cases out there and some really great ideas out there as it relates to AI. I think I mean, a great example. Like I don't really have to write Excel formulas anymore. I can do it, right? Like I
Right.
can do it, but I don't like, that's not the best. Like, I'm not a spreadsheet jockey. That's not the best use of my time, right? I can still go out and make slide decks, but that's not the best use of my time. And I can have AI do it and then rework it and edit it and change it and focus on, the messaging overall and other things in a way that, frankly, these a lot of this, to your point, administrivia is just time consuming and brain taxing work. Um, so completely agree. And then, I also, but before we wrap up here today, James, just curious, any other points you'd like to make about whether it's FirstNet, it's 911, next gen 911, or and then AI as it relates to both of those, anything at all that we missed?
Uh, yeah. So I don't think we necessarily missed anything. I think that the weird thing from my experience, especially in a program as large as FirstNet, was getting as much right that we did. Like,
Mhm.
um, it hasn't been, for lack of a better term, templatized for other government agencies, and there are key strokes that we made, like going the objectives route instead of the requirements route, um, allowing companies to ask as many questions as they want. I mean, like we answered about 4,000 questions, I think, during the course of the market research and the RFP phase, engaging with vendors as much as we did, um, traveling and talking to eventual users of the network as much as we did, being effusive and transparent in everything we did. That stuff is still not being on the outside now and understanding how frustrating it can be to engage with government on some of these procurement efforts. It's not that they can't do it differently. Um, Government can do really cool, innovative stuff, and I think with FirstNet we saw that in action for sure. And that's not just me; that's the entire team that was behind it, and also those partners throughout the federal apparatus that had an interest in seeing FirstNet come to fruition, as well as our state and local partners. Definitely a big village, big tent. Um, when we talk about AI, and I think this is something that we're going to struggle with. You know, Telecommunications when FirstNet was born was relatively new. It was about 20 years old. If you think
Mhm.
about the refresh cycle for a network is about 6 to 10 years, or was at the time. We had gone through 1G, 2G, and we were just at 3G, 3GS, right, and then 4G. Um, that was about 20, 25 years. AI has been around for probably about the same amount of time, and we're seeing it now as commercial users and in our hands. With and the odd thing here is that it felt like no one was really ready for it, and they didn't have time. People didn't have time to prepare outside of science fiction. Certainly, government didn't have time to prepare. And so, my point is that if government wants to, you know, capitalize on what is essentially it's not an emerging technology. Again, this has been around for a little bit. We're just this version of it is now new.
Mhm.
Using this version, the Chat GPT and the bards and whatever co-pilots, whatever the name is, that large language model approach needs to be embraced more than it needs to be, sort of shoved away. And the best thing the government can do right now is establish um, some procurement channels, or at least some market engagement channels, uh, to figure out what those use cases really are. And I don't just mean at the federal government. I mean, when we talk about public safety in particular, being less risk averse and adapting to some of this stuff, and putting some training wheels on it, right? As the government tends to do, slow it down a little bit, get to learn or understand it. That's the only way you're going to make it work. The, the other aspect of FirstNet was we had a lab. We had telecommunications engineers. We still have them there. And that wasn't just to hire people who knew networks, is because we wanted to challenge status quo. We wanted to challenge the vendors that came in and told us it had to be done a certain way.
Mhm.
And you've got a lot of vendors right now, a lot of companies that are saying AI should be one thing, and let's change that paradigm a little bit. Let's have the government say, well, that's fine, but there's another use case here that we're missing out on, and whatever that is, bring it
Mhm.
to the table. You
Yeah.
can't do that without engaging with the market, without having the conversation and doing an assessment of what your actual needs are as an agency. So there are lessons to be learned there, in every technology procurement. Some are done better than others. I'm proud to have been part of FirstNet. I think you can do the same thing with NG911 for sure. If you just sit down and think through it, and you look at the technology that's available to you now, in just the last 5 years, what's come out, it's all. I mean, it's blue sky.
Yeah.
So we should stop being so cynical and
Yeah.
come out from behind the curtain and start talking to folks about what to do with it.
1,000%. And I think your points are all well received, especially as it relates to the government. And I mean, the reason, like I told you, the reason I'm doing this podcast is because the government with the market and their with their power in the market, and not just buying power, but power through
Right.
policy, legislation, everything else, has the ability to influence a lot of these things, right? And I think some agencies have been doing good job, like a really good job with engagement. Like I saw an RFI come out from, I want to say, VHA earlier this year, looking for use cases, and in it specifically spelling in the RFI, specifically spelling out that we're not just looking to put AI in the environment just to do it. We don't know what's out there.
Yeah.
We're asking for help, but we want to decrease the administrative burden on our medical professionals in the Veterans Health Administration.
Right.
That's great, right? Whether it's other things through like SIBR sitter programs, or
Hmm.
where the government has the ability to fund innovation. Another great thing, and I know like some agencies specifically have calls set aside looking for AI, ML, and data use cases as well. Um, but I also think that, like, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And
That's right.
I think for a lot of the government people on the program side and the procurement, they don't have the time to understand the marketplace at that level, or to necessarily understand the marketplace enough to even know what questions to ask and what questions should be asked. And I think that we really
Oh
should.
yeah.
I think modernizing the procurement process is absolutely something that AI can and should be used for, whether it's the upfront process or evaluation criteria,
Yeah.
or like a pass fail. Did you write the right number of pages in the right font in the
Right.
right size? Because people have lost bids because they didn't do that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of great ways that the government can engage on AI, but I'm hopeful
Well,
and optimistic.
yeah, I am too. Don't take anything I said as
Yeah.
anything other than optimistic. But I'm cautious about it because, but as I was talking about FirstNet, the incentives for industry and government to do something together were very much aligned in a way that
Mhm.
it's really hard to get to. Because there was cash on the table, there was spectrum as an asset, and there was a willing marketplace for change. That's lightning in a bottle. When we talk about emerging technology like AI, the incentives are pretty different, right? They're pretty drastically opposed right now. Um, I can't. I know some of the RFIs you're talking about. I think the challenge is getting government to, like you said, ask the right questions, but also for industry to acquiesce a little bit and go, you know, we in on the commercial side have been doing this for a number of years. We're creating these products and services for enterprises that we're selling to now. I mean, if you saw the Copilot rollout from Microsoft, they did like they 7 companies on the Fortune 100, and you had to have some sort of pedigree to get access. And even then, when they deployed it, there was like it's kind of like they flipped the switch, and
Mhm.
people were like, "What is this?" It was a little bit like Clippy, if you remember Clippy showing up
Oh, I
in
remember Clippy, man.
that. It's
That's
like that.
that's the best paperclip out there, man.
Look, it has eyes.
Mhm.
But it was a little bit like that, and it's a little unsatisfying because it was a very, you know, I would call it like industry narcissism. Like, my product's great. I'm going to roll it out. You're going to love
Mhm.
it. Maybe. right? Government, on the other hand, is totally insulated from this. I know that they've tried to roll out in some agencies a version of like I think USAID came out a couple weeks ago, and they were the first to roll out like ChatGPT or whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, I can tell you that I've been witnessing another agency broad enterprise rollout of a similar tool, and it is not going well because there's an integrator involved, right? There's a commercial use case that's being squeezed into the government, the round peg into the government square hole, or square peg in the round hole, and it's falling flat for the users. And we're missing an opportunity in those cases to say, before you do anything, right, large integrator, whoever you are, um, you need to consult with the users and create a feedback loop as to what they plan to use it for. And the second you run up against a compliance issue, we need to stop, get
Mhm.
creative, and say, is this really a compliance issue in 2024? Or is this something that was written in 1973 that we can now unlock with technology and figure out how to put guardrails in place to make this experience more satisfying? Because that's typically where they run into walls, right? Like if PII, whatever the SBU, whatever the acronym is that says you can't do something with AI with an LLM.
Mhm.
Not to go down a rabbit hole, but that's what you see. So that integration of customer success, which the government's really not great at, and their providers really aren't great at either because it's never been a thing. We need to be more sophisticated about that engagement. So then the government's incentive to go be innovative and the industry's incentive to go sell kind of meet in the middle, and you get something that's maybe not ChatGPT 5 or whatever, but something that works in the environment for the users that have said, I need these three things. You deliver on it, everyone's happy. That's totally possible. So we'll see what happens, but you just got to you got to pull the curtain back a little bit and have these conversations, have some industry days.
Mhm.
Don't be scared to talk to the industry. We see this all the time at Terra Group. We talk to agencies, and they're surprised when we say you don't have to do all that stuff. You can do these three things and still get something out of
Mhm.
AI or whatever the technology is. And I think they appreciate that, right? Because I'm not trying to run them over with like a huge payday. I'm trying to work for them, just
Mhm.
like I did with public safety. Like, I don't want to give you everything. I don't put everything on your screen. If you don't want it, you shouldn't have to use it, right? Like,
Yeah.
you should use the things that work for you.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
anyway,
1000%, man. No, then, yeah, you gotta have access to know what problem you can solve, and then it needs to be, industry shouldn't try to just jam solutions down people's throats just to sell it to them, right? Like there
yeah,
absolutely needs to be end value. But yeah, man, I really appreciate it, James. I really appreciate you coming on Robots and Red Tape today. I've really enjoyed our conversation and I've learned a lot. Thank you.
no, thanks, Nick. I appreciate you taking me on this journey.
Yeah, man.
Podcast, by the way.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to Robots and Red Tape.